It was supposed to be an ordinary summer afternoon. The Miller family had driven out to the state park, about 40 minutes from their small town, looking for a quiet place to spend a Saturday together. They brought with them a cooler full of sandwiches, a folded blanket, and a red rubber ball that belonged to their youngest son, 8-year-old Jacob. The day was warm, the kind of weather where the air feels still beneath the trees, and the sound of cicadas carried across the clearing. For the parents, it felt like a chance to escape the noise of town life. For Jacob, it was just another adventure in the woods. The clearing they chose was remote, further back than most families usually went. It was ringed by tall oaks and thick underbrush, with a narrow dirt path winding away into the trees. It seemed peaceful, even safe, and the parents laid out their picnic blanket with no reason to imagine anything sinister. Jacob played nearby with his ball, sometimes kicking it, sometimes tossing it into the air, darting around the grass in bursts of energy the way children do. His older sister sat reading on the blanket, barely glancing up, while his father set up the cooler and his mother fussed over sandwiches. Everything about it was unremarkable, until the moment it wasn't. At some point that afternoon, Jacob's ball rolled toward the tree line. No one paid much attention at first. He had chased after it dozens of times already. His mother later recalled seeing him dart toward the trees, calling out a playful, "Don't go too far." She expected him to return within seconds, but seconds stretched into minutes, and when she looked up, the clearing was empty. Jacob was gone. At first, there was no sense of panic. His father assumed he had chased the ball just a little further than usual. They called out his name, expecting the sound of running footsteps to come back through the undergrowth. But the woods answered only with silence. His sister got up, half annoyed, half curious, and began looking too. Within 5 minutes, the parents were shouting. Within 10, they were running. The park was large, covering miles of forest and trails, but in that first hour, the family still believed he had to be close. His father pushed through the trees, breaking branches, yelling until his voice cracked. His mother ran in circles around the clearing, scanning the tall grass and brambles for the flash of a red shirt. When they regrouped, out of breath and terrified, the reality began to sink in. Jacob wasn't coming back on his own. They called 911 from a cell phone, their voices trembling as they tried to explain that a boy had vanished in the woods. The dispatcher told them to stay put, that help was on the way. Within half an hour, 2 park rangers arrived in a truck. They began canvassing the area, shouting Jacob's name as radios crackled with updates. By the second hour, local deputies were on scene. A perimeter was set, and the family was asked to stay, near the picnic area while officers spread out. As night fell, the search expanded. Flashlights pierced the forest, beams cutting through darkness as voices echoed off the trees. A K-9 unit was brought in, and the dogs picked up a faint scent heading deeper into the woods. But after a few hundred yards, it dissipated, as if Jacob had vanished into thin air. By midnight, helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping the canopy in wide arcs. The clearing that had seemed peaceful only hours earlier was now the center of chaos. Squad cars lined the dirt road, volunteers arrived with headlamps and hiking boots, and the boys' parents sat in shock on the edge of the blanket that still lay spread across the grass. The search continued until dawn. Rescuers called, whistled, and clapped, hoping Jacob would respond. They fired a series of shots into the air, a tactic meant to guide lost children toward the sound. Nothing. The woods gave back only silence. By morning, news crews were setting up at the trailhead. The story of the vanished boy spread quickly, fueled by the chilling simplicity of it. A child runs after a ball at a family picnic and never comes back. Interviews captured the father's hollow voice, insisting he had only looked away for a moment. The mother's tearful plea begged anyone with information to come forward. Every detail, the time of day, the location, the boy's red shirt, was repeated endlessly, but none of it brought him back. Investigators pressed the family for specifics. What exact time had Jacob disappeared? Was there anyone else in the area? Did they hear anything unusual? Their answers were frantic, fragmented, and contradictory, as often happens under trauma. Some officers believed the boy had wandered too far and became lost. Others quietly considered the possibility of abduction. Theories swirled, but in those first hours, nothing was certain. By the end of the first full day, more than 100 people had joined the search effort. Neighbors, church groups, and total strangers fanned out through the forest. Still, the boy was nowhere. A toy ball was eventually found, lodged beneath a log near the tree line. Beyond that, there were no footprints, no clothing, no sound of movement in the brush. The trail ended abruptly, as if swallowed. For the family, the picnic had become a nightmare that would never end. The blanket, the cooler, the sandwiches left uneaten, all of it was still there, unchanged. But the boy who had been laughing only hours earlier was gone. The mother clutched the ball when it was returned, her knuckles white as she held it like a lifeline. The father stared blankly into the woods, unable to comprehend how the trees could hide his son so completely. As night fell again on the second day, the search intensified. Helicopters returned, their blades thundering overhead. More volunteers arrived, but despite the massive response, the result was the same. Jacob had vanished without a trace. The investigation, the suspicion, and the heartbreak would only grow darker from here. But on that first day, the question was simple and devastating. How could a boy run after a ball, only yards from his family, and never come back? The first full morning after Jacob vanished, the search effort grew into something massive. By sunrise, the trailhead was packed with parked cars and trucks. Neighbors, co-workers, church groups, and strangers from nearby towns had all arrived, ready to help. Some carried flashlights, others brought bottled water, ropes, or maps of the park. The sheriff's office organized them into search parties, each assigned to a grid of forest. Deputies warned volunteers to stay within their marked zones, but the woods were thick and disorienting, and the sense of urgency pushed many to stray further than advised. People shouted Jacob's name over and over, pausing to listen, hoping to catch even the faintest reply. But the only sound that answered was the drone of insects and the crunch of leaves underfoot. K-9 units were once again deployed. Early in the morning, handlers reported a faint scent picked up by one of the bloodhounds. It led deeper into the forest, down toward a narrow stream. For a moment, hope surged. The searchers followed, combing the banks, wading into shallow water, overturning logs and rocks. But the scent trail ended abruptly at a bend in the stream, as if Jacob had disappeared mid-step. Handlers tried restarting the dogs from multiple points, but each time they circled back, confused, and lost the trail. By noon, it was clear the dogs could go no further. Overhead, helicopters swept low, their rotors rattling the trees. Spotters peered down at the canopy, scanning for a flash of red fabric, the boy's shirt color, or any sign of movement. From above, the forest looked endless, a green ocean stretching out in every direction. Despite hours of searching, nothing unusual stood out. On the ground, searchers checked fallen logs, hollows, and small caves, all places where a child might seek shelter. Every discovery brought a jolt of anticipation, a scrap of cloth, a set of small footprints, only for investigators to confirm each belonged to volunteers or local wildlife. As hours turned into the second full day, investigators began to expand their focus. They interviewed the family again, pressing for details. What time exactly had Jacob run into the trees? How long before they realized he was gone? Did they see anyone else in the clearing or on the trails? Under the weight of shock and exhaustion, the parents' answers weren't consistent. The mother said she thought it was around 2 o'clock. The father insisted it was closer to 3. The sister recalled hearing a distant noise, maybe a shout, maybe nothing at all. Detectives wrote it all down but noted the contradictions. Stress could explain it, or it could suggest something else. Media coverage intensified. Local news anchors framed the story with urgency. A boy had vanished in broad daylight during a family picnic, and authorities had no explanation. The public was drawn in by the strangeness of it. Television crews interviewed other families who had visited the park that day. One couple reported seeing a man in the distance near the trailhead, loitering by his truck. Another hiker claimed they heard a child scream, though the timing didn't quite match the family's account. Detectives investigated each tip, but none led anywhere definitive. By the third day, the mood of the search began to shift. What had started with frantic energy now took on a heavier, more hopeless tone. Volunteers grew tired, the heat rose and tempers flared among teams who felt their efforts were being wasted. Still, people pushed through the underbrush, scratched and mosquito-bitten, unwilling to quit while the boy was still missing. Authorities brought in divers to sweep a pond half a mile from the picnic area, fearing the worst. But the divers found nothing except mud, branches, and old bottles. In the command post set up at the trailhead, maps were plastered across tables, marked with colored pins showing every area that had been covered. By the fourth day, nearly the entire park had been swept, yet there was not a single confirmed trace of Jacob beyond the ball and the faint scent trail. Detectives admitted to reporters that the case was turning baffling. In cases of lost children, some kind of evidence, shoes, footprints, or a discarded item, usually turned up within the first 48 hours. Here, it was as though the forest had swallowed him. Behind the scenes, investigators started to consider darker possibilities. They quietly ran background checks on registered sex offenders in the area. They examined vehicles leaving the park, stopping some for questioning. They canvassed nearby highways, asking if anyone had seen a boy matching Jacob's description being forced into a car. But no credible witness accounts emerged. There were no ransom notes, no calls, no signs of an abduction that left physical evidence. Every path investigators took circled back to the same dead end. The family was interviewed again under harsher scrutiny. Detectives asked the father to reenact his movements in the clearing. They pressed the mother on why she didn't notice Jacob had been gone sooner. They questioned the sister about whether there had been arguments in the family that morning. Nothing incriminating surfaced, but the inconsistencies in their memories kept fueling speculation. Some officers privately admitted they were no longer certain if this was a tragic accident or something else entirely. By the end of the first week, the official narrative began to take shape. Authorities told reporters that despite the enormous search effort, hundreds of volunteers, K-9 units, helicopters, divers, there was no trace of the boy. They admitted publicly what they had been reluctant to say earlier. The trail had gone cold. The working theory was grim and vague. Either Jacob had wandered further than anyone thought possible and perished in the wilderness, or he had been taken by someone who left no evidence behind. In either case, hope was fading fast. For the family, the sense of unreality deepened. They had watched the search unfold with desperate hope, clinging to each new lead, only to watch them collapse one by one. Now, a week later, the clearing was quiet again, stripped of the chaos and urgency that had filled it. The trees stood still, the grass bent underfoot where volunteers had trampled it, and the picnic blanket lay abandoned in the trunk of their car. The silence pressed in, leaving the parents with a question they couldn't escape. How could a boy vanish so completely, surrounded by hundreds of searchers, and leave nothing behind? As the search for Jacob stretched beyond the first week, something began to shift. At the start, the family had been surrounded by sympathy and support. Neighbors brought food to their house, churches organized prayer circles, and strangers hugged the mother at the trailhead, whispering that they were praying for her little boy. But sympathy has a half-life. With no answers, no progress, and no new evidence, people began to ask questions, hard questions, about what really happened that afternoon in the clearing. For investigators, the silence of the woods was troubling, but it was also telling. In many missing child cases, if no physical evidence is found in the wilderness, suspicion eventually turns inward, toward the people closest to the victim. Detectives quietly began reviewing the family's background. They pulled financial records, medical histories, even school reports. They questioned teachers and extended relatives, asking whether there had been tension at home, whether Jacob's parents ever lost their temper, whether there were cracks beneath the image of a normal family picnic. Reporters soon picked up on the same line of questioning. The mother, who had once been portrayed as a grieving parent, now found her face on tabloids with headlines asking if she knew more than she was saying. The father's interviews were replayed in slow motion on news broadcasts, with anchors pointing out how he avoided eye contact or seemed vague about the timeline. In the absence of new evidence, the family themselves became the story. Detectives also returned to the inconsistencies from their original statements. The mother swore she saw Jacob run toward the trees around 2 o'clock. The father insisted it was closer to 3. Their daughter thought it might have been later still. Investigators wondered, were these the normal lapses of memory under stress or deliberate efforts to cover something up? Each interview seemed to produce slightly different details, small shifts that grew suspicious when stacked together. Behind closed doors, detectives conducted more pointed interrogations. They asked the father to take a polygraph. He agreed. The results came back inconclusive, which only deepened suspicion. The mother also took a test, and hers suggested deception on certain questions about whether she knew where Jacob was. Polygraphs are not admissible in court, but in the eyes of investigators, they raised red flags. Meanwhile, rumors began to swirl through the community. At the grocery store, people whispered that Jacob's parents had been fighting in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Others said the father had a temper, that neighbors sometimes heard shouting from the house. None of these claims were proven, but once suspicion takes root, it spreads fast. Community support fractured. Where once there had been vigils, now there was doubt. Some neighbors quietly pulled away. The parents were also criticized for their behavior in public. In the eyes of reporters and investigators, grief is supposed to follow a certain script: tears, desperation, visible breakdowns. But Jacob's father sometimes appeared calm, even stoic during press conferences. His mother sometimes smiled nervously when asked a question, a habit she had always had, but one that now looked damning on camera. Clips of her nervous laughter were replayed with ominous music in nightly news segments. To the public, the family looked unreliable, even suspicious. Detectives also looked into the family's finances. They learned the father had recently been laid off from his job. Bills were piling up. There were arguments about money. Investigators asked whether the stress of financial trouble could have played a role in the boy's disappearance. Theories began to take shape, some as dark as they were unlikely. Had the boy been hurt accidentally at home and the picnic used as a cover? Had one of the parents snapped under the pressure and done something unthinkable? No evidence supported these scenarios, but with no other explanation, they remained on the table. The mother, overwhelmed by the suspicion, broke down during one interview. She cried out that everyone thought she had killed her own child. Detectives noted her reaction, but pressed harder, asking whether she knew something she wasn't admitting. She swore she didn't. Still, the more she insisted, the less people seemed to believe her. The family's attorney eventually advised them to stop giving interviews altogether. To the public, their silence looked like guilt. Within weeks, the search for Jacob had become 2 stories running in parallel. One was the hunt for a missing boy, still officially ongoing, though with little new ground to cover. The other was the question of whether his own parents had played a role. Media outlets dissected their every move. Former FBI agents were brought onto talk shows to speculate about the mother's body language. Online forums erupted with theories, some suggesting abduction, others pointing the finger squarely at the family. The Miller home became both a shrine to a missing child and a target of suspicion. For Jacob's sister, the shift in public perception was devastating. She was old enough to understand the rumors and young enough to feel the weight of them directly. At school, classmates whispered about her family. She grew withdrawn, isolated, as the shadow of suspicion hung over her house. And yet, despite the suspicion, police could not move the case forward. There was no physical evidence linking the parents to foul play. No witnesses saw anything unusual. No trace of Jacob was ever found in their home, their cars, or their belongings. The case was strong in rumor, but weak in fact. Without proof, detectives could not make an arrest. As weeks turned into months, the case stalled. Search teams had long since gone home. The news cycle moved on, though whispers lingered in the town. For the family, life became a purgatory defined by silence and suspicion. They were grieving parents in one sense, accused villains in another, trapped in the void where their son's absence had left them. What no one knew then was that the truth of what happened that day was buried not in their home, not in their past, but far deeper in the woods, waiting years to be uncovered. With suspicion mounting and the trail already cold, investigators turned to theories. If the parents were not responsible, then what could explain a child disappearing so completely in broad daylight? The first theory was the simplest: an animal attack. The woods were home to black bears, coyotes, and the occasional mountain lion. In rare cases, children had been taken by predators. Detectives consulted wildlife experts who admitted it was possible. But animal attacks almost always left behind signs: blood, torn clothing, drag marks, or prints in the soil. Searchers found none of these. The forest floor around the clearing was trampled from the massive search. But even in those first hours, no one saw evidence of a struggle. If an animal had taken Jacob, it had done so without leaving a trace, which seemed unlikely. The second theory was far darker: abduction by a stranger. The park was open to the public, with trails winding for miles and multiple access points where vehicles could enter and exit. Could someone have been lurking that afternoon, watching from the tree line, waiting for an opportunity? Witnesses reported seeing a white pickup truck parked near one of the less-used trailheads, the driver lingering longer than seemed normal. Deputies tracked down the owner, a local man with no criminal history. He admitted being in the park that day, but said he was simply fishing at a nearby stream. His story checked out. Still, investigators could not shake the possibility that someone had been close enough to snatch Jacob in those few unguarded moments. Detectives interviewed campers who had been in the park that weekend. Some recalled hearing strange noises in the distance, what they thought might have been a child crying. Others said they saw a boy running through the trees, though when pressed, the descriptions varied wildly. Some swore he wore a red shirt, others insisted it was blue. A few even thought the boy looked older than 8. None of the accounts matched closely enough to be useful. Every potential sighting collapsed under scrutiny. Hunters also reported unusual experiences. One man claimed he saw a small figure crouching near a ridge at dawn a week after the disappearance. He thought it was a child, but dismissed it as his imagination. Another hunter insisted he found footprints too small to belong to an adult in a muddy patch deep in the woods. But when investigators checked, the tracks had already washed away in the rain. Each tip ended the same way: inconclusive. The possibility that Jacob had wandered too far on his own remained on the table. Children in survival situations often make decisions that defy logic. Instead of following water downstream or staying put, they panic and run. Could Jacob have bolted deeper into the forest, disoriented and frightened until exhaustion overtook him? Search experts pointed out that the terrain was rugged but not impassable. A child could cover surprising distances in a short amount of time. And yet, after days of intensive searching with helicopters, dogs, and hundreds of volunteers, nothing had turned up. No body, no clothing, not even a shoe. Statistically, it was unusual. Rumors began to blur the line between fact and speculation. Some locals whispered that the woods were cursed, that strange things had happened there before. Others claimed the boy had been spotted hitchhiking along a nearby highway weeks later, though investigators dismissed these as false sightings. The sheer volume of tips overwhelmed the sheriff's office. Each call was logged, each lead checked, but none provided closure. National organizations specializing in missing children became involved. They helped distribute flyers across multiple states, set up hotlines, and worked with federal agencies to rule out potential child trafficking cases. Agents combed through reports of attempted abductions within a 100-mile radius. None lined up with Jacob's disappearance. Still, the possibility remained unsettling. If someone had taken him, they had done it with terrifying efficiency. Investigators even considered the possibility of foul play involving people outside the family, but within their circle: neighbors, acquaintances, co-workers. Background checks were quietly run on anyone who had been in contact with the Millers. One name surfaced: a distant family friend with a prior conviction for child endangerment. He was questioned extensively, but had an alibi supported by multiple witnesses. Each time a lead appeared promising, it fell apart under investigation. Months later, as the case dragged on, the sheriff's office was forced to admit they were running out of options. Officially, the three main theories, animal attack, abduction, or wandering into the wilderness, remained open. Unofficially, detectives confessed that none fully explained the mystery. If it had been an animal, why no evidence? If it had been abduction, why no witnesses or physical trace? If it had been a wandering child, why no remains after such a massive search? The case seemed caught between possibilities, with no proof for any of them. For the family, each theory was its own torment. The mother couldn't bear the idea of her son suffering alone in the woods, calling out for her. The father was haunted by the possibility of a stranger taking him, imagining the terror Jacob must have felt. Every new theory opened a new wound, and every disproved lead left them back at the same starting point. Friends and relatives tried to offer comfort, but comfort meant nothing without answers. As time passed, tips slowed, volunteers stopped calling, and the search scaled back. The woods that had once been filled with the sound of voices and radios grew quiet again, returning to their natural state as though nothing had ever happened. But the silence carried a weight now, the silence of unanswered questions. In the end, all the theories shared the same conclusion: no resolution. Jacob had vanished into thin air. The official reports reflected it, the investigators admitted it, and the community whispered it. The forest had swallowed him, and no one could explain how. Yet the case remained open, suspended in uncertainty, waiting for the one clue that might someday break it. That clue would not come for years, long after suspicion had shifted, long after the family had been broken by grief, and long after the world had forgotten. By the time the second year arrived, the disappearance of Jacob Miller was no longer front-page news. In those first months, his face had been everywhere, on nightly broadcasts, pinned to bulletin boards, taped to gas station windows. His missing posters showed a smiling boy in a bright red shirt, the same shirt he had been wearing when he vanished, accompanied by a phone number and the words, "Have you seen me?" But posters fade under sun and rain. By the second year, the edges curled, the ink bled, and the once bright images looked like ghosts of a child frozen in time. People passed them without noticing. The urgency that had once consumed the town had been replaced by silence. Detectives who had worked the case tirelessly were reassigned. There were new crimes, new emergencies, and budgets that couldn't justify pouring endless resources into a mystery with no leads. The sheriff's office kept a file drawer for Jacob's case. Inside were hundreds of pages of reports, maps of the search grids, and stacks of interview transcripts. What had once been a living, breathing investigation now sat dormant, reduced to a set of folders gathering dust. The Millers tried to keep their son's memory alive. On each anniversary of his disappearance, they held vigils at the park clearing. Candles flickered in, paper bags along the trail, and family members read prayers into the quiet night. The gatherings drew crowds at first, but over time, attendance dwindled. What began as a community's collective grief slowly became a private ritual, attended mostly by close relatives and a handful of friends who refused to forget. At home, the family struggled with the weight of absence. Jacob's room remained untouched. His toys stayed where he had left them, his drawings still taped to the refrigerator. His mother admitted she sometimes sat in his room for hours, unable to move, paralyzed by the thought of packing anything away. His father threw himself into work when he eventually found a new job, though co-workers noticed he carried a heaviness he never spoke about. His sister, meanwhile, grew more withdrawn as the years passed, carrying the burden of whispers from classmates who still speculated about what had happened that day in the clearing. The wider community moved on, as communities do. New families arrived, children were born, seasons changed. The park reopened fully, trails once avoided were used again. For newcomers, the story of the missing boy was just a rumor, a local legend they sometimes heard around campfires. But for those who had lived through it, the silence was suffocating. They remembered the helicopters overhead, the search parties with flashlights, the endless nights of shouting his name into the darkness. To see it all fade felt like betrayal. The Millers clung to any glimmer of hope. Occasionally, a tip would come in, a child spotted at a rest stop, a boy seen walking along a highway, an anonymous caller claiming knowledge. Each time detectives investigated, each time the lead dissolved into nothing. The cycle of hope and disappointment broke the family a little more each time. By the end of the second year, even those sporadic tips had slowed, leaving only silence. Without new evidence, speculation hardened into doubt. Some still whispered that the parents knew more than they had admitted. Others believed Jacob had been taken by a stranger and would never be found. A smaller group clung to the idea he had wandered into the woods and his body simply hadn't been discovered. But without proof, every theory was just noise. The official record remained the same: missing, presumed endangered. The psychological toll was immense. Grief counselors described the family's pain as ambiguous loss, the kind of suffering that never finds resolution, because the finality of death is never confirmed. Without a body, without an answer, the Millers existed in a limbo that consumed every aspect of their lives. They couldn't move forward, but they also couldn't go back. The empty space where their son should have been defined everything. Detectives who had once led the investigation admitted privately that the case haunted them. Some said it was the most baffling disappearance they had ever seen. Others confessed they sometimes drove out to the park themselves just to walk the trail again, replaying every detail in their heads, hoping to see something they had missed. But nothing new ever appeared. The forest gave back nothing. For the town, Jacob's disappearance became a cautionary tale. Parents warned their children not to wander too far at picnics, not to chase balls near the tree line. The woods carried a quiet dread now. Families still visited, but they kept their children close, eyes flicking nervously toward the trees. The clearing where Jacob had vanished grew over with grass, nature reclaiming the space as though nothing had happened, though those who knew the story felt a chill each time they walked past. By the 5th year, the Millers had separated. The strain of loss, the suspicion from outsiders, and the endless cycle of false hope had fractured their marriage. His mother moved into a smaller house closer to her parents, while his father stayed behind, continuing to maintain the home they had once shared. Their daughter, nearly grown by then, carried the scars of her childhood into adulthood, marked by silence and unanswered questions. The case remained technically open, but in practice it was frozen. Detectives would occasionally revisit the files, but without evidence there was nothing to advance. Time dulled the sharp edges of public memory, but for the Millers, the wound never closed. Each year they lit candles at the park, each year fewer people joined them, and each year the pain of absence grew heavier. And yet, even in its cold state, the case lingered. It was the kind of story that never truly went away, the kind of mystery that lurked beneath the surface of a community's identity. Parents told it to their children as a warning, and old neighbors shook their heads when they passed the faded posters still tacked to telephone poles. The disappearance of Jacob Miller was no longer an active investigation, but it was not forgotten. It was simply waiting, buried in silence, until the day when something new would finally be uncovered. In the years after Jacob's disappearance, silence became its own presence, louder than the chaos that had filled the park in those first frantic days. The search parties were long gone, the helicopters no longer circled overhead, and the news crews had moved on to fresher stories. What remained was absence, a hollow space that the Miller family carried with them through every season, every year that followed. By the 3rd anniversary, the vigils were sparsely attended. What had once drawn hundreds of people lighting candles now drew only a handful. A few neighbors came out of obligation, others out of loyalty. But for most, the event was an afterthought. Life had moved forward for everyone else. New businesses opened in town, schools graduated new classes, children who had once stood beside Jacob in photos grew into adults. For the Millers, however, time had not advanced. It had frozen at that picnic clearing, trapping them in a story that had no ending. The family itself began to fracture under the weight of unanswered questions. Jacob's mother grew more withdrawn, her health declining as the years went on. She often spent hours in her son's room, staring at his belongings, still neatly arranged as if waiting for him to return. His father coped differently, burying himself in work, avoiding conversations about the case whenever possible. The silence between them grew heavier than the grief itself, until eventually the marriage collapsed. They separated quietly, without public statements, but everyone in town knew. For Jacob's sister, the silence was its own prison. She grew up marked by whispers and sideways glances. At school, children asked questions that carried the sting of accusation. What did your parents do? Why didn't you stop him? What really happened that day? She learned not to answer, not to speak of her brother at all. By the time she reached adulthood, she carried the story like a shadow, one she never invited, but could never escape. The town itself developed an uneasy relationship with the memory of the case. Some spoke of the woods as cursed, insisting that Jacob's disappearance was not the first time strange things had happened there. Hunters claimed they felt watched in the forest. Hikers said they heard voices in the distance. Whether those accounts were real or born of imagination, the story of Jacob Miller became entangled with local folklore. Parents warned children not to wander near the clearing where he had last been seen, though few could explain why. Others believed the truth was far simpler and far more sinister, that someone local knew more than they had ever admitted. Rumors lingered about suspicious neighbors, about the stranger in the white truck who had been questioned but never charged. Some insisted the boy had been taken and hidden in plain sight, perhaps even raised under another identity. Without proof, these theories remained nothing more than speculation, but they never fully went away. In a small town, rumors are difficult to bury. Over the years, law enforcement revisited the case sporadically. Detectives would reopen the file when a new lead came in, or when an investigator with fresh eyes wanted to take a look. But each time, the effort stalled. Nothing ever connected. The evidence was too thin, the years too long. Eventually, the case became one of many in the sheriff's office archives, its details remembered only by those who had been there from the start. Still, the family never stopped waiting. Jacob's mother spoke occasionally to reporters, though her words grew fewer with time. She said she could not accept that her son was gone without knowing for sure. She lived in the small space between denial and resignation, refusing to let go of hope while being unable to find peace. His father gave fewer interviews, often declining requests altogether. He was tired of being scrutinized, tired of every gesture being dissected for meaning. For him, silence was safer. Years stacked on top of each other. Birthdays came and went with an empty chair at the table. Holidays were marked by forced smiles and unspoken pain. Photographs of Jacob remained in the family home, though each year they seemed to belong to a different time, a different world. The boy in the pictures never grew older, never changed. The rest of the family aged around him, and that contrast was unbearable. By the 10th year, Jacob's name was rarely spoken outside his family. In town, the story had shifted into legend, told to newcomers as a haunting anecdote. People would say, "That's where the boy disappeared," when pointing toward the park, but fewer remembered the details. For the Millers, however, every detail remained sharp. The ball rolling toward the tree line, the silence after his name was called, the moment when everything changed. They relived it endlessly. The 13th year arrived with little ceremony. Jacob's mother still lit a candle, his father still avoided the subject, and his sister tried to live a life outside the shadow of her family's tragedy. The town had long since stopped expecting answers. To most, the story was frozen in time, a mystery with no solution, another reminder that life sometimes left wounds that never closed. But the silence that had defined those 13 years was deceptive. It gave the impression that nothing would ever change, that the story had been sealed forever. No one knew then that the forest, the very place that had swallowed a child so completely, still held its secrets. And in the summer that followed, when hikers stumbled upon something buried beneath moss and leaves, the silence that had lasted more than a decade would finally break. It was 13 years after Jacob vanished when the silence finally cracked. On a humid summer afternoon, two hikers set out on a trail that wound deep into the state park, far beyond the usual paths where families picnicked or casual visitors wandered. They were experienced outdoorsmen, used to bushwhacking off marked routes, pushing into places most people avoided. That day, they found themselves in a section of forest that felt undisturbed, the ground covered in thick moss, the air heavy with the smell of damp leaves. It was there, in a shallow clearing half hidden by overgrowth, that one of them noticed something unusual lying just beneath the surface of the earth. At first, they thought it was trash, an old piece of fabric, maybe left by campers years ago. But when they bent down to inspect it, their stomachs tightened. It was small, faded, and clearly once red. Nearby lay a single shoe, cracked with age, its laces stiff and frayed. A few feet away, they found the rusted shell of a metal lunchbox, its paint worn off by weather, the latch corroded shut. The objects looked out of place in the untouched forest, strange relics scattered in the moss as though someone had dropped them and never returned. The hikers exchanged a glance neither of them would forget. They knew immediately these were not just forgotten belongings, they were evidence of something much darker. Cell service was weak that far into the woods, but they managed to get through to 911. The dispatcher listened as they described what they had found, and within hours, sheriff's deputies and park rangers had descended on the site. Yellow tape was stretched between trees, marking off the clearing as investigators moved cautiously through it. Photographs were taken of each object, positions noted, soil samples collected. For the first time in more than a decade, Jacob Miller's case had real movement. News traveled quickly. By that evening, reporters were at the trailhead, their cameras pointed at the line of police vehicles parked along the dirt road. Questions spilled out. Was this connected to the missing boy? Had evidence finally surfaced after 13 years of silence? Authorities refused to confirm anything, but everyone knew the implications. A red fabric scrap, a child's shoe, a rusted lunchbox, details that matched perfectly with what Jacob had been wearing and carrying the day he disappeared. For investigators who had worked the original case, the discovery was jarring. Many had retired, some had moved on, but they remembered the details as if they had happened yesterday. They remembered the red shirt, the picnic lunch packed in a small tin box, the sneakers he wore when he ran toward the tree line. Now, those items, or what was left of them, had been found in a secluded spot of forest, far beyond where search parties had scoured. The question was no longer whether Jacob had been in those woods. The question was what had happened to him there. The site itself told an unsettling story. The objects were scattered, not buried deeply, but partially covered by leaves and moss, as though they had lain undisturbed for years, hidden only by the natural growth of the forest floor. Some items were rusted or decayed, yet unmistakable in shape and size. The clearing seemed unremarkable otherwise, just another pocket of trees and moss. But to investigators, it felt like a graveyard of evidence. The discovery reignited the case with a force that startled everyone. Detectives who had long since resigned themselves to never finding answers were suddenly back at work. The area was combed carefully with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. Cadaver dogs were brought in to sweep the clearing and its surroundings, their handlers watching closely for any reaction. The forest, which had once offered nothing but silence, now became a crime scene, yielding small fragments of a story that had been frozen in time. For the Miller family, the news was devastating but impossible to ignore. Jacob's mother received the call first. She described it later as a moment of simultaneous collapse and confirmation. For years she had begged for answers, clinging to the idea that something, anything, would one day emerge. Now, it had. She drove to the trailhead, where deputies stopped her at the tape. She stared into the woods she hadn't entered in over a decade, knowing her son had been there all along. His father reacted with equal devastation, his stoicism breaking under the weight of seeing his son's belongings held up in evidence bags. Their daughter, now an adult, admitted she had almost stopped believing the truth would ever surface. The discovery forced her to confront emotions she had buried for years. Reporters swarmed the story, calling it the most significant break in the case since the day Jacob disappeared. They showed images of the clearing from a distance, the yellow tape fluttering in the humid air. They reminded viewers of the boy who had gone missing at a picnic 13 years earlier, replaying old footage of the family pleading for help. The contrast between then and now was chilling. Back then, searchers had scoured every inch of the park, yet here, in a remote pocket, lay the very belongings that might have closed the case if they had been found sooner. The sheriff's office confirmed publicly that the items appeared to match those Jacob had with him on the day he vanished. They stopped short of declaring it proof, saying forensic analysis would be needed. Still, the implication was clear. The belongings had survived 13 years in the woods, hidden from view, waiting to be uncovered by chance. For the community, the discovery reignited old fears and questions. If the boy's things had been there all along, how had the massive search missed them? Did that mean he had died there, in the clearing, just beyond where anyone thought to look? Or did someone place the items there later, deliberately hiding them? Theories began to swirl once more, but this time there was tangible evidence to fuel them. What had once been a mystery sealed in silence now had a crack in its armor. The clearing had offered the first real clues in more than a decade, and as investigators began to sift through the soil and examine every fragment, they knew the forest was finally beginning to give up its secrets. What they would uncover next would change the entire direction of the case. When the discovery in the clearing was confirmed, forensic teams were dispatched immediately. What had begun as a chance encounter by two hikers was now treated as the reopening of a cold case crime scene. Investigators in protective suits worked slowly, methodically, documenting every square foot of the area before disturbing a single item. They marked the locations of the shoe, the torn fabric, and the rusted lunchbox with numbered flags, photographing them from multiple angles. To outside eyes, they looked like ordinary objects, weathered and degraded by years of exposure. To detectives who remembered the case, they were hauntingly familiar. The red fabric matching the shirt Jacob had been wearing, the lunchbox identical to the one his mother had packed with sandwiches on the day of the picnic. Soil samples were collected first. Forensic anthropologists knew that even after years, soil could hold microscopic evidence, traces of decomposition, fibers, or chemical residues. Teams dug small cores from different parts of the clearing, bagging each carefully to prevent contamination. They swabbed the surfaces of the objects for potential DNA, though the odds of surviving genetic material after 13 years in the elements were slim. Still, science had advanced in the years since Jacob's disappearance, and investigators knew that even the faintest fragment could prove significant. Then, attention turned to the ground itself. Some officers noticed shallow depressions in the soil a few yards away, subtle but distinct, as though the earth had once been disturbed and then partially reclaimed by nature. To the untrained eye, they were nothing more than uneven patches of ground. But to seasoned investigators, they suggested something unsettling, either a grave that had collapsed over time or evidence that someone had buried items long ago. The decision was made to bring in ground-penetrating radar to scan the site. The radar revealed anomalies beneath the soil, irregular shapes inconsistent with natural formations. The readings showed voids and disturbances, clustered in the same area where the depressions had been spotted. Forensic teams began carefully excavating, removing layer after layer of earth with trowels and brushes. Every movement was deliberate, as though peeling back the years of silence inch by inch. At first, they uncovered more small fragments, rusted zippers, a plastic buckle, bits of degraded fabric. But then, as the soil was brushed aside, something emerged that froze everyone in place: small, fragile bones. The excavation halted as specialists were called in. Forensic anthropologists knelt in the dirt, brushing carefully, mapping each fragment. One by one, bones surfaced, delicate and unmistakably human. Their size left little doubt. These were not the remains of an adult. They belonged to a child. The clearing that had once been written off as empty now revealed itself as a burial site. Word spread quickly back to the sheriff's office and then to the press. The story that had haunted the town for 13 years had taken a chilling turn. Reporters camped near the trailhead, waiting for confirmation. Officials refused to release details, stating only that human remains consistent with a juvenile had been recovered. Behind the scenes, however, investigators knew they had likely found the answer everyone had feared. The remains were transported to a state forensic lab for examination. Specialists began the painstaking process of reconstructing the skeleton, analyzing every bone for signs of trauma. They looked for fractures, for evidence of animal activity, for anything that could explain how Jacob's life had ended. At the same time, DNA tests were ordered to confirm identity. Despite the years that had passed, technology had advanced enough to extract genetic material from even degraded samples. Buccal swabs from Jacob's parents were taken again, providing a baseline for comparison. The results would take weeks, but investigators were confident they already knew what the outcome would be. Back at the site, detectives remained focused on context. If this was Jacob, the location raised difficult questions. Why here, in a clearing so far from the picnic area? How had the massive search teams missed it 13 years earlier? Some speculated that the remains had been moved later, deposited in the clearing well after the initial search had ended. Others argued the area had been covered at the time, concealed by brush or natural debris, making it nearly invisible even to trained searchers. The possibility that someone had deliberately hidden the body gnawed at investigators. For the Miller family, the news was devastating. Jacob's mother collapsed when told bones had been found. For years, she had insisted she needed answers, yet the confirmation that her son's life had ended in the woods brought no peace. His father, long hardened by grief, broke down in a way he never had before, finally confronted with the reality he had tried to hold at bay. Their daughter, now an adult, admitted she had clung to hope that her brother might still be alive somewhere. That hope was gone. The town reacted with equal shock. For years, Jacob's disappearance had been a story suspended in uncertainty, a wound without closure. Now, the revelation of bones shattered the illusion that he might still return. People gathered at the park entrance, leaving flowers and candles once again. Strangers who had never known him felt the weight of the discovery, as though the silence of the past 13 years had been broken by something too heavy to bear. Investigators pressed forward, determined to extract as much truth as possible from the clearing. Each bone was analyzed for signs of how Jacob had died. Forensic experts whispered about fractures in certain areas, though final reports had yet to be released. Detectives revisited every theory with new urgency. If this was an animal attack, why had the remains been in a shallow depression rather than scattered? If Jacob had wandered and died naturally, why were his belongings grouped nearby in a way that suggested deliberate placement? The evidence seemed to point toward something more intentional. The clearing, once silent, now spoke loudly. It told investigators that Jacob Miller had not vanished into thin air. He had ended his life here, in these woods, and someone or something had ensured his remains stayed hidden for over a decade. What those bones revealed would soon reshape the investigation entirely, pulling it away from faded suspicions and toward a chilling truth that no one wanted to face. Weeks after the bones were recovered, the forensic lab released its findings. DNA tests confirmed what investigators had long suspected. The remains belonged to Jacob Miller. After 13 years of silence, the truth of his fate was finally written in black and white. The family received the call in separate homes, no longer together but bound by the same unbearable grief. There was no ambiguity left. The boy who had vanished on a summer afternoon at a picnic was gone. But the results carried a second revelation, one far darker than confirmation of death. The bones bore marks that told a story no parent should ever hear. Forensic anthropologists studying the remains noted fractures on several ribs, damage to the skull, and breaks in the smaller bones of the arms. These injuries were inconsistent with a fall or with the slow work of animal predation. They showed signs of blunt force trauma inflicted before death. Some fractures showed partial healing, others did not, suggesting violent injuries delivered in a short span of time. Jacob had not simply wandered into the forest and collapsed. He had not been taken by a wild animal. The evidence pointed to foul play. Someone had harmed him. When the sheriff's office made the announcement, it shook the community to its core. For years, people had lived in uneasy limbo, debating theories but never knowing the truth. Now, officials spoke directly. The case was no longer a missing persons investigation. It was a homicide. The words struck like a hammer. A child had been murdered in their own park, in broad daylight, and the killer had lived free for 13 years. The press conference was brief, but its impact was devastating. Reporters crowded the sheriff with questions. Who had done this? Was there a suspect? Was the killer still out there? Officials declined to provide details, citing the ongoing investigation. But the silence only fueled fear. Parents who had once told the story of Jacob's disappearance as a cautionary tale now realized it was more than just a mystery. It was proof that someone in their region had gotten away with killing a child. The Miller family was left shattered once more. Jacob's mother wept openly in her first interview since the discovery, saying the confirmation was both an answer and a wound. For years she had prayed he might still be alive somewhere. The hope had been slim, but it had been hope. Now that fragile thread was cut forever. His father, speaking through an attorney, said he wanted justice but admitted he doubted he would ever see it. Their daughter, grown now, gave a short statement that revealed years of quiet suffering. She said the confirmation had destroyed any illusions she had clung to, and that knowing her brother's final moments involved violence was worse than not knowing at all. The town once again found itself under the cloud of suspicion and rumor. Some remembered early inconsistencies in the parents' statements and wondered if detectives had overlooked something. Others pointed fingers at old suspects who had been dismissed years ago. The discovery of trauma on the bones reignited whispers that had never fully gone away. For law enforcement, the challenge was monumental. They were now investigating a homicide 13 years after the fact, with evidence degraded by time and weather and memories grown hazy or deliberately forgotten. In court documents later released, investigators outlined the evidence: the DNA link, the witness testimony, the suspect's prior history of offenses involving children. The case against him was overwhelming. Prosecutors announced they would pursue the maximum penalty. The sheriff told reporters that justice, though delayed, would finally be served. For Jacob's parents, the confirmation was devastating in a way that silence had never been. For years, they had lived with uncertainty. Now, the truth was undeniable. Their son had not simply vanished into the wilderness. He had been abducted and killed by a predator who had lived quietly among them. The mystery had never been about a lost child. It had always been about a predator hidden in plain sight. The town struggled to come to terms with the revelation. Some neighbors admitted they had always felt uneasy around the man. Others were shocked, unable to reconcile the image of someone they passed at the post office with the horror of his crime. The realization that he had been part of their community for so long, walking freely while the Miller family suffered, unsettled everyone. The story that had once seemed inexplicable now had a human face, and it was a face they recognized. At the sentencing, Jacob's family addressed the court. His mother spoke through tears, saying her son had been stolen not only from her, but from everyone who loved him. His father demanded to know why, though the suspect never gave an answer. He sat silently as the judge handed down his sentence, showing no remorse. For the family, justice was delivered in the legal sense, but it did not bring peace. Their son was still gone, and nothing could undo that. The case closed officially with the conviction, but the story lived on as both a warning and a scar. For the Millers, the years of silence had ended with a truth too heavy to carry, a truth that would shape the rest of their lives. For the community, the haunting realization remained that the predator had not come from outside, but from within. He had lived just beyond sight, blending into ordinary life, until the forest finally gave up his secret. The boy who had vanished on a family picnic was never lost to the wilderness. He was taken by someone hiding in plain sight, someone who walked among them for 13 years. The truth, when it came, was devastating but undeniable.